Hello. Nicolai Ghiaurov was a Bulgarian bass whose operatic career went from the 1950s to the 1990s. With his rich, smooth and powerful voice, he is considered one of the best basses, or even the very best, of the second half of the 20th century. His performances and recordings of Italian, Russian and French opera have been praised in the most enthusiastic terms. Ghiaurov studied in Sofia, Leningrad and Moscow, and after 6 years of patient and methodical musical and vocal training, he made his operatic debut in 1955 as Don Basilio in The Barber of Seville, a role which he was to sing many times in his life. He very quickly added the most demanding bass roles in Italian, French and Russian opera to his repertoire. He gave numerous performances in opera houses all over the world, including, for example, at the Metropolitan Opera in New York, where he performed 10 different roles. As you will no doubt have noticed, a large amount of the appeal of Ghiaurov's voice comes from the pure melodious beauty and smoothness of his tone. This is abundantly evident in the early recordings of Russian songs that he made, accompanied on the piano by his then wife Zlatina. This famous Tchaikovsky song provides a good example. But there was considerable variety in his work. One very melodramatic role, that of Mephistopheles in Gounod's Faust, was a staple of his repertoire, and he certainly had the vocal and theatrical resources to be very convincing in it. Here he is singing the famous aria in a concert in Munich in 1966. Despite the concert format of the performance, we can see his very evident gift for dramatic characterization and his commitment to the role. Here is a second extract from Faust, the scene in the church where the desperate Marguerite attempts to pray but is prevented by Mephistopheles. Despite its mediocre quality, the recording gives us a good idea of the huge size of his voice, which so impressed those who were lucky enough to see him live. Here he is on stage with Mirella Freni, whom he married in 1978 and sang with very often. The role of the dashing bullfighter Escamillo in Bizet's Carmen, also in French, is in a similar larger-than-life vein. Though Ghiaurov never sang it on stage, as far as I know, he made a couple of recordings of the famous aria. Like Mephistopheles, it is a role often taken on by bass baritones, but he has no trouble at all with the high register, which he sings with characteristic bass weight. It may have been this rather attractive tendency to lift all the weight of his voice into the top range instead of adapting his technique to the pitch that led to the vocal problems that he experienced as he approached 50. Ghiaurov sang a very different type of role, that of Don Giovanni, a handful of times between 1964 and 1970, and also recorded it. This was the only Mozart opera that I am aware of him having sung, and he shows a remarkable ability to adapt his large voice to this role. This live performance in Salzburg of the Champagne aria, conducted at a lively pace by Karajan, shows his agility and his ability to lighten the voice as appropriate. The role of Don Basilio in The Barber of Seville, which was not only Ghiaurov's first role but also his last from what I can gather, provides a relatively easy evening for the singer, which was, no doubt, why he sang it for so long. The high point is the famous Calumny aria. Here, Ghiaurov performs it in concert with characteristic wit and careful use of the text. The bass part in the Verdi Requiem is another complete contrast to the preceding roles, and one in which Ghiaurov's performance was simply the best around during the 60s and 70s. He recorded it several times and also did many public performances, some of which were filmed or recorded. This is the one which he made with Karajan in 1972, when he and the other excellent singers were in marvelous voice. This is a perfect illustration of his remarkable vocal abilities, but also of his musicality and sensitivity. Ghiaurov was particularly famous for his performances of a number of roles which enabled the singer to really develop the interpretation of the character in question. The role of King Philip II in Don Carlo is one of them. Here he is, live in 1983, singing the famous aria in which the insomniac king laments the fact that his young wife has never loved him and looks forward to truly resting only in death. It is an aria which enables the performer to bring out the humanity in the powerful monarch, which Ghiaurov does excellently. As I have mentioned earlier, Ghiaurov's voice was not the same at this stage of his career, after the age of about 50. It was no longer as flexible, and the high range had become less easy. But, while diminished, the voice is still undeniably beautiful, with a marvelous legato, and he uses its expressive possibilities to the best effect. This aria is immediately followed by the famous confrontation between the king and the Grand Inquisitor, one of the rare bass-bass duets in opera. In this recording of a live performance much earlier, the two singers are well matched in terms of power and vocal expressiveness, and the natural difference between Ghiaurov's mellifluous tone and Martti Talvela's granite-like voice points up perfectly the contrast between the more humane king and the cold, intransigent Grand Inquisitor. Ghiaurov is extremely impressive here in a live performance, sharing the stage with another very powerful singer, but still capable of subtle nuances and beautifully smooth singing. Boris Godunov is another role that Ghiaurov made his own, singing it from very early in his career and recording it with Karajan. Here too he is able to bring out the human depth and drama of the role without resorting to histrionic exaggeration, and always concerned to sing the notes as written. Early in the opera, Boris emerges from the church where he has just been crowned, not in a mood of triumphalism, but apprehensive and asking for God's guidance. At the end of the opera, Boris dies, realizing that he has blood on his hands. He takes leave of his son and begs God for forgiveness. An assessment of Ghiaurov's place in the world of basses would lead us to compare him only with the very best. There are Shaliapin and other Slavic basses in previous generations, and his fellow Bulgarian, Boris Christoph, who was slightly older than him. Among his contemporaries, only Cesare Siepi is really considered by many to be his equal in terms of vocal ability and expressiveness. To finish, here is the end of an aria by Rachmaninoff, which particularly suits his immense vocal gifts, and in particular his ability to swell a note with no loss of quality and that characteristic attractive vibrato.